Scientists in the 1950s performed some classic experiments. Basically, rats would learn to press a bar and then they'd get a treat, they'd get a reward. And then the scientists gave a dopamine antagonist, block the dopamine to these same rats, and they no longer pressed the bar. And that became the idea that dopamine, especially dopaminergic pathways in the nucleus accumbens, that were for pleasure and addiction. And for years and years, and still today, you'll hear people refer to dopamine as the addiction or pleasure neurotransmitter. But as so many things are, it's more nuanced than that. So, because after all, high dopamine isn't always associated with pleasure. Think of schizophrenics. People with schizophrenia have high dopamine levels, and they don't experience more pleasure than other people. Soldiers with PTSD, they show increased dopamine activity when they hear recorded sounds of combat. And in animals who have been stressed, for instance, they've just lost a fight with another animal, they have a spike in dopamine. And these are negative things. These are not pleasurable things, yet they're associated with a spike in dopamine. And additionally, dopaminergic neurons in the nucleus accumbens will often discharge in anticipation of a reward, not during the actual reward. So if an animal knows their treat is coming, that's when you can see the spike in dopamine, not during the treat. So it might be that instead of just controlling pleasure, dopamine seems to be involved in the motivational processes behind attaining a goal. So how hard will you work for your goal? How long will you focus on your task? How do you weigh the costs and benefits, the costs and rewards of exerting that effort? Now, Dr. John Salamone of University of Connecticut, he's done some really neat studies to support this idea, the role of dopamine as a motivational force. What he does is he artificially raises and lowers dopamine levels in animals, and then he allows them to choose between two rewards: a less desirable reward that's easy to get, and a more desirable reward that they have to work a little harder for. For example, you have rats, and at one end of the pathway, there's a pile of food. But at the other end, there's a bigger pile of food, but they have to jump over a small barrier to get there. So which way will they choose? Because the food is still pleasurable, it's still a goal, but how's their motivation? How hard do they want to work? And Salamone found that animals with lower dopamine levels, they're much more likely to just opt for the easy one, less effort for less reward. But the animals with normal dopamine levels, they will exert more effort. They will jump over that barrier to get the bigger reward. So the lower levels of dopamine make people and other animals work less hard for things, and higher levels may be related to higher motivation. So let's go back to those soldiers. High levels of dopamine in the soldiers with PTSD, when they hear gunfire, that's motivation to get out of the way. Animals who've just lost a fight have a spike in dopamine, motivation to fight or flight. People with depression sometimes, maybe there's a theory that there's low dopamine. And it might be that they're not able to make themselves go out and be with friends. They know if they were to go, they might actually have a good time, but the motivation isn't there to get them to go do it. So it may be that dopamine is certainly complex. It plays a role with addiction, plays a role with pleasure, but motivation may be underlying both of these things. Science is a process. We keep learning more every day. Isn't that cool?